One, you know my guests from Hikma History, and if you don't, shame on you. Here and today, we're going to talk about the modernization of Afghanistan. And before we start with this, I want to ask, how did you get, what inspired you to start Hikma History?
Okay, so firstly, I'd like to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Tariq. I'm the person that started Hikma History, like Erlend said. So in terms of how I started it, it was just history's been a passion project of mine for as long as I can remember. I always liked studying that more than any other subject in school. So it wasn't very difficult for me to be able to choose that as the subject that I would move forward with. In terms of Hikmah history specifically, I was just in a place in my life where I wasn't really doing that much besides going to university, and I felt like things weren't really happening. So I decided to just come up with this side project that I could do and dedicate some energy to. And it actually started off with an Instagram page, believe it or not, where I would post a picture and have a description to the picture of a battle or a key figure. And from there, it kind of snowballed into me starting a blog and then into me starting a YouTube channel.
And we're going to talk about the modernization of Afghanistan. And you told me that this is what you had a PhD in. So how did you end up with this?
So just
this
a little
topic?
clarification. I haven't finished my PhD. I'm 2 years into it. But this is the topic. The modernization of Afghanistan is the topic of my PhD.
And I want to begin with asking, because I think we should take a look at what was the state like before the modernization started. If you could talk about a little bit about the situation.
First we need to kind of periodize when Afghanistan's modernization began. Obviously, the most popular dates roughly that are going to be given are going to be from the 1920s onwards. So after the reign of King Amanullah, especially in the reign of the last king Nader Shah. But you can trace Afghanistan's modernization, I would say, to the middle, somewhere towards the middle of the 19th century, around the reign of Sher Ali Khan in the 1860s and 70s. He tried to do some very basic modernization programs, for instance, with a postal service, and even modernizing the military along European lines by giving them all a single uniform. Though those weren't really that successful because his reign was interrupted by the Second Anglo-Afghan War, and he died shortly afterwards. But it really starts in the reign of Habibullah from 1901 to 1919. That's when Habibullah, whose father was the Iron Emir, Abdurrahman Khan, who's seen in history as a very cruel disciplinarian type figure, when his father passed away, a bunch of people who had been exiled by his father were able to come back to the country from different parts of the world, like India or the Ottoman Empire, and bring back the expertise that they had learned with them in their new foreign settings. And when they came back to Afghanistan, they obviously made use of that knowledge. So it's really in the first decade or two of the 20th century.
But so like you said, let's talk about the state. What was like living in Afghanistan at this time, if you will?
What can you specify what you mean exactly?
Like how, without the modernization process, and how, because you kind of said, I think you said this in your video about this topic as well, that it was kind of a backwards country at this point in time.
Right. Well, that word isn't a very, I would say that that's not a great word to use, because it's like, yeah, it's just not like every country kind of progresses and develops at its own pace. But I would say maybe using the word primitive is slightly better, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. Yeah, it was just, if you think about it, life would have been much more basic, much more primitive. The interconnected web that the interconnected web of life that modernization has facilitated wouldn't be there. So roads would be few and far between, like well paved roads. Communication between people from far away places would not necessarily be as accessible as we would imagine today. Economies would be much more basic as well. People would have certain crafts or certain skills that they would do, and they would essentially stick with that for most of their lives or whatnot. And yeah, it was just a very, very rural, agrarian type of life.
How did Amanullah Khan come? Sorry if I said his name wrong, but how did he come to power?
Amanullah Khan. How did he come to power? Well, his father got assassinated in 1919, in the beginning of 1919, because we don't know who killed him exactly, but I mean, if I was to guess, if I was to have an educated guess, I might actually point my finger at Amanullah Khan, because in the lead up to his assassination, his father had been becoming more and more unpopular, especially with the royal court, as a result of the fact that World War I was happening, and you obviously had the Ottoman Empire siding with Germany versus Britain. So more and more people within Afghanistan, especially at the royal court, were calling on the Emir Habibullah, the father of Amanullah, to wage war on the British, try to invade India. But the Emir, Amanullah's dad, was not a fan of that. He wanted to remain neutral versus the British, and so he just he didn't go to war. And nobody knows for sure, but that's probably a very important contributory factor to his assassination. And to be fair, actually, I should mention this. Amanullah didn't come to power straight after his dad. His uncle, Nasrullah, who was the brother of his father, he came to power for, I think it was like a week, 6 days. And then Amanullah came through his uncle in prison and just became the emir.
And how much power did the king have at this point? Was it an absolute monarchy, or was it like starting to become more ceremonial thing?
Well, it's a little bit of both. It's the king would have been the most powerful figure in the realm by far. However, like with any society that has organization, there are certain principles to abide by, or certain rules. So even though the king would have been the primus rex, I think is the Latin saying, the alpha male, he would have been careful not to annoy certain factors of Afghan society. For instance, the tribes, certain tribal elders would have been very powerful. So the king would have been, the emir would have been the most powerful person, but he would have had to been respectful of the power of other figures as well.
So were Afghanistan independence? Because I was rewatching your video in order to have some topics to discuss to this video and episode, and it did seem like they weren't entirely independent.
Yeah, that's like a good way of putting it, is that they weren't entirely independent. Basically, when the British during the 19th century, the British and Russia had something called the Great Game. Have you heard of that?
No.
So the Great Game was a rivalry between the two powers, Britain and Russia, over Central Asia, basically
Mm.
Afghanistan and Persia. And so, within that context, Britain invaded Afghanistan twice in the 19th century. The second time, when they invaded, they made the Emir, the leader of Afghanistan, sign a treaty in 1879, which basically, stated a bunch of stuff. But one of the terms of that treaty was that the foreign policy of Afghanistan would be essentially in the hands of the British Viceroy in India. So the Afghans were able to essentially do whatever they wanted inside of their country, but when it came to foreign affairs, that was in the hands of the British.
And how did Amir feel? Like, was he more of a puppet at this, or was he? How did he feel about this
So
person? Do we
that's
know
that's a
this?
so that's the very interesting thing, is that common sense would dictate that Amir would be a puppet, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, that wasn't so. Um, because of what I stated previously, the British had an agreement saying you can do whatever you want in your country, but when it comes to foreign policy, you're not allowed to have a role in this. And there were times when it made it very difficult for the emir to save face in front of his people, in front of his society, when everybody knew that the British were in control of their foreign policy. For instance, in 1907, the thing that is credited with ending the Great Game is the what's it called? The 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention. I'm pretty sure, where essentially Britain and Russia delineate zones of influence in Central Asia, but they do not invite or ask the leaders of the country whose fate that they are determining. So Persia and Afghanistan in this instance. And the Afghan emir was livid. He was very angry. He complained to the British. He was going to lose face with his people. This is Amanullah's dad, by the way, Habibullah. And yeah, so it's just a very strange scenario where they're not puppets, but they don't have full independence.
What did Britain have to gain from controlling their international policy?
My bad. I should have said this. So, like I said a few questions back, this is within the context of the Great Game. So, Britain was very worried and suspicious and paranoid about the Afghan ruler talking to the Tsar as well. So, because that's what the Afghan ruler was essentially doing in the lead up to the first Anglo-Afghan War, where Dost Muhammad Khan, he was playing off the Russian Empire versus the British Empire to get a favorable deal, kind of like what the Afghans would do 100 years later in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and America. Play off two superpowers to get a favorable deal. And the British, because Afghanistan shared a border with India, and India was, quote unquote, the cash cow of the British Empire, the British would act very aggressively when it came to matters of India. If anything harmed their position in India, in British India, then the British would act very, very aggressively. And one of those aggressive acts was to force the Afghan emir to concede his foreign policy, his country's foreign policy.
And we have to remember that this is also before Pakistan exists as a country.
Exactly, yeah. So the British didn't want the Afghans to talk to the Russians, so they just took their foreign policy.
Did they have a good relationship with Russia, the Afghans people, and the Afghan government?
It wasn't bad necessarily, but they were foreigners. I mean, so it's not like it was anything special because, I mean, similar to the British, I know it's different sect of Christianity. They were not Muslims. They're still Christians, you know. They're Orthodox Christians, the Russians. So you have to take that into consideration. But yeah, it wasn't anything special. It was the same as what their relationship with the British was like. But then the British one got worse, by the way, obviously, because they went to war with them 3 times.
So Amanullah Khan want to start to modernize Afghanistan. And how does it do this? How does it start modernizing? How does it get the economy to modernize his country?
So that's the thing. He didn't have the economy to modernize the country. And that's why, well, not why, but it's a key reason why I failed. It's a key reason why modernizing in Afghanistan is very difficult in the first place, because it requires a lot of funds that are not necessarily there in place, right? So he so his modernization plan, obviously he most likely would have wanted it to be very comprehensive. However, because of the lack of funds and resources available to him, it was quite focused, meaning, for instance, in the education sector, what he does, well, he sets up 3 schools in Kabul, the capital, a German-speaking school, a English-speaking school, and a French-speaking school, where he sends basically a bulk of the curriculum would have been taught at those schools in the respective European languages. And once people graduated from those schools, they would have an opportunity to go study abroad in those respective countries, and then obviously come back to Afghanistan with the things that they had learned so that they can be implemented in the hope of moving Afghanistan forward. So in terms of Amanullah's modernization plans, he in his reign, there isn't very much for him to show for it, if you see what I'm saying. Like, there wasn't huge industrialization programs. There wasn't a huge agrarian programs taking place like we see in Soviet Union, like a decade later. But the biggest thing that Amanullah contributed in this regard was what I just said, the 3 schools, because the people that went to those schools during Amanullah's reign, obviously they were not of age, because I think those schools went up until about they were lycées, which is like French for high school, I think. So I'm guessing around 16 or maximum 18. And those people came of age in the 30s. So then a bunch of civil servants that you see in Afghanistan who aid the modernization of the country as bureaucrats, etc., they were taught in the 1920s in these European language modern schools.
Was this a good idea, do you think, or was this the right thing to do, putting up these 3 schools, sending them abroad to these, like you said, respective countries? Did this work out the way he thought it out to be, or did it go wrong?
I think no. I think in terms of Amanullah's modernization plan, let's call it, that was probably the best element of it, in every sense of the word. In terms of the practical benefits it bore Afghan society, in terms of how little resistance there was to this, as opposed to some of his other elements of modernization. For instance, when it came down to clothing or women, the way in which, the negative way in which Afghan society, huge chunks of Afghan society reacted to that, clearly that was not a very smart political move to make, because it raised the enmity of powerful but also very large segments of Afghan society. So, and that's partially what led to him being forced off the throne in 1929.
And who takes over after Amanullah Khan, and what happens then?
So Amanullah in 1928 went on a 9-month journey from it's mainly through Europe, but he goes to Egypt and places like this as well. And he comes back. The whole point of the journey was to go and in a similar spirit to what I mentioned earlier with the students, to bring back knowledge that can be implemented in Afghanistan. And yeah, so when he comes back towards the end of 1928, his modernization, he starts talking publicly about the things he had seen and his vision for Afghanistan. And this vision of Afghanistan was much more aggressive, let's say, in the pace in which he wanted to pursue it. And like I said, it wasn't very popular with a significant portion of Afghanistan. And so there are tribal revolts in the east of the country with the Shinwari tribe, and then around Kohistan to the north of Kabul with a man named Habibullah Kalakani, who eventually becomes the new emir. But he is only emir for, I believe, 8 months, maybe 9 months, because another person from the royal family by the name of Nader Shah, who was a cousin of Amanullah, he raises an army and basically takes on Habibullah Kalakani and defeats him, executes him, and then he becomes king in 1929.
And then what happens?
And then, so very importantly, so Nader Shah, he is quite a cautious man. However, he was born and raised in British India, so he would have had quite a modern education. And he mixed those two together, which is a very fascinating, very interesting blend, if you ask me, because his military background gave him some sort of a conservative outlook at the pace of change. So when he came into power, he gave interviews to European journalists where he openly talked about how the things that Amanullah wanted to bring about were not necessarily wrong, but it's just the pace at which he moved at, the pace of his modernization plan, it was just far too quick and far too ambitious. So having said that, the first thing he does is he more or less reverses everything that Amanullah wanted to do in terms of the societal changes that were very unpopular, things to do with women, things to do with religion. He just unwinds the clock. But with the education side of it and the military modernization side of it, he doesn't rewind the clock. He gets behind, he throws his weight behind that, which is a very smart move politically, if you think about it, because Afghans were not necessarily against the idea of modernizing when it came to material things, such as I want a better road, or I want just material things, a better car, or they didn't necessarily have cars, but like better shoes, things of these nature. They didn't necessarily have any qualms with this kind of a modernization. But when it came to societal / cultural modernization of having to move away from certain traditions, or having to infuse certain new ideas that were at loggerheads with customs that you have respected and celebrated for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, that is the thing that Afghans, or most of Afghan society, was very hesitant about. So, and Nader Shah very adroitly, very smartly recognized that. So he didn't play around with things that would have necessarily provoked Afghan society, like the traditional elements of it. And he just more or less focused on slowly but surely extending the authority of the central government through centralization, and at the same time focusing on military modernization.
And
Yeah.
what about Amanullah Khan when he gets replaced? What happened? You said he worked around Europe, but what happened? What when he come? Does he come back at some point, and what happens then?
No. So there's like all throughout the 1930s, Nader Shah and his family, they're super paranoid that Amanullah might come back, because Amanullah had very strong support amongst a certain sector in society, which was that sector which was young, which was hungry for political change, and they might have tasted some of the consequences of those reforms in education that Amanullah had brought in. So amongst certain university students, he was very popular, and Nader Shah's family is quite paranoid about that. But no, Amanullah dies some 3 decades later in Rome, I believe. I think it's Rome, yeah. He just stays in exile until 1962.
And of course, a very famous person, which we all probably heard of, certain Adolf Hitler comes to power, and why? And Afghanistan choose to side with Nazi Germany. Why is that? Why did they choose to side with Adolf Hitler?
That's a great question. That's a great question, because Hitler, the Nazis, World War II, Holocaust, anything related to that kind of subject matter has such a strong grip on Europe and even America, to be fair, America's consciousness, that it's tough to have. Maybe in academia it's changing a little bit, but it's tough to have mature discussions about this, because when you say what you just said, and what you said is correct, by the way, Afghanistan's government in the 1930s decided to side early on, before the war sparked off, with Nazi Germany, and that's because of their experience with the other side. So who's on the other side? Britain, France. Yeah, mainly Britain and France, right? So, I mean, France, they're a little further away from Afghanistan. I don't think France had any colonies that were all that close to Afghanistan.
I don't know how far Philippines are from Afghanistan.
No, they're very far from Afghanistan. You probably need like a 12-hour flight to get from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But Afghanistan had had a very traumatic experience, or traumatic experiences, because they had 3 wars with Britain. So it wouldn't have made sense for Afghanistan to be buddy with Britain, because, I mean, they got their hands burnt 3 times. They finished fighting for independence from the British only 14 years before Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor. So it wouldn't make any sense. But I should mention that when World War II started, Britain, and I'm sure Soviet Union did the same thing, they essentially gave an ultimatum to the Afghan government. You can't be on the side of the Nazis. If you are, we're going to essentially invade you. You're at war with us. So if you have any Nazi or fascist Italian diplomats in your country, you have to ask them to leave. And the Afghan government was more than willing to oblige, considering what happened to Iran.
Did they choose to stay neutral during the war, or did they help try to support
Afghanistan?
Yeah.
No. They basically obliged what Britain asked from them. So technically, they're not fully neutral, but they were neutral in the sense that there was no fighting done by Afghans.
Yeah. And then the war ends, and the Soviet Union, and of course we know how the war ends. We don't have to go through that part, but something happens with Afghanistan, and they decide to kind of try to play off both sides, the Soviet Union and America, if I remember this correctly. So what made them realize think that this could be a good idea, that we're gonna try, that this gonna work out? Because obviously it doesn't go their way. And what made them think that it was a good idea to play off both sides, both Afghanistan and America?
we have to rewind a little bit. So
Yeah.
one of the most important things, and this is going to sound kind of funny, but one of the most important things in Afghanistan's history in the 20th century was World War II. And it's going to sound funny because they were not actually involved in it. But basically, the war put such a tremendous strain on Afghan society as a result of food prices going up, just prices across the board going up in Afghanistan's economy, that something triggered in the mindset of those running Afghanistan, that what they had to do after the war had to be a little bit more radical than before the war, and radical in the sense of how they approached the question of change and reform, the speed at which they could have change and reform. Because obviously prior to 1939, 10 years before that, Amanullah was in charge and he was getting kicked out of the country because people were saying that you want reforms and change too quickly. So when Nader Shah and his son, Zahir Shah, from 1933 onwards, when they came to power, they made sure to not annoy Afghan society, the tribal and traditional elements of it, which make up the huge bulk of it. But then when World War II finished, they realized how vulnerable they were to the world. They realized the great scope of power that these states have, with dropping nuclear bombs, with having armies that have multiple millions of soldiers. So the Afghan status quo in charge of the country, they decided that it's a matter of survival, not a matter of opinion regarding how quickly they need to reform and how quickly they need to modernize. So they just threw all of their eggs in one basket and decided that in order for them to survive, in order for them to be a viable state within this international fraternity, they needed to modernize as quickly as possible. And one of the ideas that they had was to play the two superpowers off each other. And obviously with hindsight, it's very easy to sit here and say, oh, that was such a foolish move, because look at how
But
it ended up.
Did it make sense at the time that this was a good idea?
Absolutely, because it provided very real benefits. Because when this is happening, Erlend, post World War II, from say like 1945 to the Vietnam War, there is this idea out there floating about in the minds of American policymakers called developmentalism. Have you heard that before?
I don't think so.
All right, so developmentalism is essentially where you think that you focus on trying to help other countries, third world countries around the world, become more modernized through developmental projects such as the construction of dams, the construction of roads, something that helps aid them in their attempt to become industrialized or modern. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So when the Cold War is going on and the Soviet Union and America are essentially auditioning for the rest of the world's support, one tool that America had at their disposal, and to be fair, the Soviet Union did the same thing, was they would go to countries that were, say, neutral and say, hey, be our friend. We will give you $50 million in aid money to help build you an airport.
Who says friends can't be bought, eh?
Exactly. That's literally what's happening. So the Soviet Union would go to the Afghan royal family in the 1950s, say, hey, we'll give you $100 million to build, and we'll help you, by the way, with Soviet engineers to build a dam and an airport. And so the Afghan elites would go to the Americans and say, hey, you know, the Soviets are offering us 100 million for this. The American, do you want to, you know, give us a counter offer, like a proper free market, right? Free market economics. And the Americans might, you know, give more to ensure that they stay on their side as opposed to the other side. So it had a very real consequence in boosting up the even the standard of living, to be honest, but just the overall modernization of the country, because we're talking about huge numbers. Like from 1950, I have my notes in front of me, from 1950 to 1965, Afghanistan applied for and received more than $80 million in loans from the Export-Import Bank. 1955, Soviet Premier Khrushchev rolled out more than $100 million in credit that would facilitate Soviet engineers to construct airports, dams, factories, and highways. So these are going to have very real consequences on Afghanistan's infrastructure. So it obviously benefited Afghanistan.
Was this a prosperous time for Afghanistan when they got all these offers from both sides? Would you say?
Prosperous is a very relative term, because if like Erlend, you're situated in Norway, right?
Yeah.
And I'm situated in the UK. If you compare 1950s Afghanistan to, you know, today's Norway or today's UK, it's definitely not prosperous. It was poverty stricken. However, if you compare 1950s Afghanistan to 1910s Afghanistan, then yeah, it would have been much better. It would have been much better. I don't know about prosperous, but roads are being constructed. You're seeing the emergence of a fully functioning airport. In the 60s, I think there's a second one in Kandahar. And the modern education, there's a university. Students, some of the most gifted students are having scholarships abroad, and they're coming back with, you know, far better knowledge than they would have had access to in Afghanistan. So it was a time that Afghans today look at as, say, the last, you know, kind of like a lost golden age type of scenario, because it was definitely prospering and it was modernizing. It wasn't prosperous or modern, but there was also the rule of law was pretty strong, because the royal family, remember when I said that after Amanullah, Nader Shah focused on extending his government's authority across the country, remember?
Yeah.
That by the 50s and 60s, that really starts to bear fruit. Because if you look at Afghanistan topographically, it is very hard to rule the whole country, because there's, you know, just there's huge mountains. You got to build roads through the mountains. There's deserts. There's all of this stuff. So communication is very tough. And by the 1960s, the hard work and the diligence of the government was bearing fruit, like I said.
Was there a certain hope in the country that this is gonna end well, this is gonna go, we're gonna make it, we're gonna become maybe not a first world country, but we're gonna become better? Was there hope among the people of Afghanistan at this time?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. I have to be careful because I don't want to talk out of pocket, because that's not necessarily the focus of what I study. However, what I study does touch upon that. There was definitely a sense of patriotism about the country. You would have students that go abroad and study in America, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in all these places. And if they wanted to, of course, humans can be very creative creatures. If they wanted to, they probably could have found a way to stay in those countries, to defect, kind of like what Cuban athletes do when they go compete internationally. They'll just go and stay in the country and defect. But that wasn't really happening with these students. They would more or less, not all the time, but a lot of the time, most of the time rather, they would come back to Afghanistan. And more so than anything, to me, that speaks about patriotism, about having some sort of a hope in the country.
Loyalty.
Loyalty, exactly. But more so kind of what you alluded to with your question, a sense of hope that the country is moving in the right direction. Because it was a very dynamic time in Afghan society. Huge changes were taking place on a political level, because these modern schools, whilst they created engineers, doctors, diplomats, they also created, ideologues and politicians who came up and started, entertaining new ideas, new ideologies, such as communism, such as democracy,
Yeah, I
such as
want to talk about
republicanism.
this, and there's the downside, rather, if that's the correct term for it.
Hmm.
That when they did come back from America and the Soviet Union, which was the two major powers at the time, they did have different ideologies. So let's talk about how this changed
Absolutely.
Afghanistan into the modern state that we know it as
Let's
today.
do it. Let's do it. That's a very pertinent subject matter, because you're right, especially with the Soviet Union side of things. When the Soviet Union was on good had good relations with Afghanistan, and there was this back and forth of students traveling to the Soviet Union for training and education. This did happen where the students came back and they became, or at least superficially, espoused communism. So many of the people that became the leaders of the Afghan Communist Party, the PDPA, later on in the 70s and 80s, they had actually trained and studied abroad in the Soviet Union earlier, maybe in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. So you definitely do see that precedence. At the same time, you get a group, certain people within the political elite that would like greater democracy, and this group is supported by young university students. And so what eventually happens is, in 1963, the king essentially says, I am going to properly take over and run the country. Because for the 30 years before that, Erlend,
Yeah.
the king was obviously, the person in charge of the country, but he didn't have full executive authority across the board, or he didn't exercise executive authority across the board, I should say. For the first 20 years of his reign, up until 1953, that was in the hands of his uncles. He had three later. And then from 53 to 1961, 1962, that was in the hands, was it 1961 or 19? I think it's 1960. Oh no, it's 1963. Sorry. So 1953 to 1963. It's his cousin, Dawood, who, spoiler alert, is going to be the person who topples the monarchy in 1973 and establishes a republic. But he was quite an iron-fisted type ruler, and when the king asked him, his own cousin, to step down in 1963, the following year, you have something called the Constitution, Afghanistan's Constitution of 1964, where the king basically says, we are going to have some sort of a constitutional monarchy. There's going to be elections, there's going to be parties, the king is going to stay in charge. However, he will elect prime minister, which, by the way, was not going to be a member of the royal family. So that's a huge deal. And what that basically did, Erlend, is it really excited these different political parties with their different ideologies.
Wasn't it at this time as well that he allowed freedom of speech and freedom of the press as well?
Very nice. So I was just about to get onto that, because when these elections and just this greater freedom in the political sphere was announced, it created a lot of excitement, a lot of nervous excitement, and it had quite a negative effect on the Afghan political sphere, because to go hand in hand with these new elections, with the new constitution, etc., like you mentioned, there was going to be freedom of press. So these political parties would have certain newspapers that were essentially the what's the word for it? The term, the mouths of their ideologies. So that strengthened divisions within politics between, say, communists, between those who were pro-monarchy, etc. And it obviously had very negative consequences, because things get so chaotic that in 1973, Dawood Khan, the person who was president from 53 to 63, just realizes that there is so much chaos that he comes and topples the monarchy, even though, funnily enough, he is part of the royal family, and he establishes a republic under his iron fist.
Is this where things started to go wrong? That we see things go not go in the right direction?
I think it would that's a little bit earlier, because I think all of that stuff happened in the 1960s. Obviously, this is what we're talking about. Discussions of this nature, they're a process. So you can't. It's not fair to say, oh, it was this year or it was that event, etc. But it's really in what's called the constitutional decade, 63 to 73, that these issues started really coming to the surface. Because as the communists are becoming more powerful, it has this effect that Afghanistan is quite a religious country, as I'm sure you know. There is a new political strand pops up, almost in a reactionary sense to the rising power of the communists within Afghanistan, which is the Islamic fundamentalists, who don't like what they see in terms of how the Afghan communists are getting more and more power. So they become more politically active from the late 1960s onwards, as a response to the communists. Because the communists, to be fair, were having, I mean, nobody really handled themselves with a lot of dignity on the political level, but the communists were especially bad in this sense, because they had certain tactics where, for instance, just riling up young university students to call strikes or to call protests, or to prevent entry to the House of Parliament for the MPs. So these kind of tactics were used to create, like, these kind of obstructionist tactics were used in a to create greater chaos, I guess. Well, I don't really know what their aim was, essentially. But yeah, like, just in the 1960s alone, there was more than 2,000 strikes, demonstrations, and protests by the students of Kabul. Yeah.
And I know you don't have much time, so we're gonna have to try to wrap things up soon. But I want to mention the Soviet invasion as well. So what since they seem to you mentioned that they seem to have rather good relations with Soviet Union and Afghanistan. So what makes Soviet Union decide that we don't invade Afghanistan?
Well, so like we've been talking about, the with there being Afghan communists and them rising in prominence, they well, I have to take a step back.
Yep.
So not only Erland were there Afghan communists in becoming prominent on a political level because of political parties they were establishing, or newspapers that they were creating. There were also, and this is actually a significant part of it, a bunch of military officers in the Afghan army were trained in the Soviet Union, and they would have been influenced by communist ideas, and they would have empathized with communist ideas and call themselves communists, but they were lodged in the Afghan army in key positions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like I'm trying to build a picture for you, because you're getting communist journalists, essentially, communist ideologues, communist politicians, and communist military officers. That is quite a significant, quite an important group of people that are coming together.
So you would say that the majority of people that came back from studying abroad were communists and had studied in the Soviet Union, or compared to the Western world like America, Britain, and Germany, wherever?
No, I don't think that's fair to say. I don't think that's fair to say, because you've got to remember, Erland, with history, all you need is one person. Like, of course, we're all equal, but historically speaking, some people have had a greater impact than other people. Like, I mean, Genghis Khan has had a greater impact on human society than my great great uncle. Like,
Absolutely,
no offense to my no offense to my great great uncle, but it's just, it is what it is. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like a numerically high number. It could just be 10 guys that are just very prominent in their sectors, and they make huge waves of change. But essentially, to get back to your original question, 1973, the monarchy is toppled by somebody who, funnily enough, is from the royal family, former President Dawood Khan. He recruits the communists to help him take power, essentially, in 1973. Then the president realizes that the communists are getting pretty strong and that he just doesn't like their outlook. So he tries to get rid of them in terms of not giving them important positions in power. The communists see this, they don't like it. They organize a coup amongst themselves, with because remember, they've got very important high-ranking military officers, part of their party, and they execute that coup 28th of April, I think, 1978. It's called the Sour Revolution, and that's what brings them to power.
And I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but would you kind of say that the modernization of Afghanistan is sort of a Shakespearean tragedy?
What do you mean?
Like, it doesn't end well, and we see the situation in Afghanistan right now. And I don't know if I haven't studied at the point of view, but like, you see, it's not great, to put it that way, for the lack of a better word.
Right.
So would you say it's a tragedy in a sense?
You can definitely think of it as that. I never thought about it like that, but I guess you can think about it as a tragedy from the perspective that they're going through. It's a country where they know they need to modernize. Forget about really lofty, moral, cool reasons. Literally just for survival purposes, they know they need to modernize in a globalizing community, right? But that endeavor is getting in the way of them doing it. Like the fact that they are so hell-bent on trying to modernize, like the whole issue around modernization is so prominent that it leads to the greatest roadblocks and obstacles that prevent that from happening in the first place. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you'll get rulers, for instance, you get a variety of different rulers. You get rulers that really want change to happen quickly because they're super worried about being left behind by every other country out there.
Yeah.
And the society will go, no, you're going too quick. Then you get rulers that go really slowly, and then things will happen on the international scene like World War II that will make the rulers realize, wow, we are so weak and primitive. We need to go faster. We need to modernize faster. And then you get rulers like the communists who have their own vision on how to modernize and make themselves stronger, but that is at loggerheads with the wide majority of Afghan society. And obviously that doesn't work either. So it's a really, well, it's not actually that tricky, but people, like most things in life, people make it trickier than it has to be.
Who would you say, in your mind, it's just probably a broad question, but who do you think had the right idea to the modernization program?
I like that question. I love questions like this. It would be Nader Shah.
Why is that?
Well, because remember I told you that when he came to power in 29, he gave interviews to European journalists, and he said modernization is not wrong. It's all about the pace. For me, that's what it's all about. It's all about the pace, because all right, so this is going to sound kind of complicated and convoluted, but just give me a moment, Erlend. Yeah. So Afghanistan's problem is that it's like a double problem, and it is quite complicated in the sense that it needs to modernize 100%, otherwise it dies. But it has to modernize in a certain type of a way. So if it modernizes too quickly, it annoys too many people who think that their culture and traditions are being eroded. But at the same time, if it modernizes too slowly, we have the same problem we talked about earlier, where it dies. Other countries will modernize quicker than you, and you'll just be left behind. So, but you have to think about this problem deeply. So if you modernize really quickly, yes, it will allow you to keep up with the rest of the world and not die in that respect. However, the pace at which you bring the change will naturally make it very difficult, Erlend, to keep your eye on every little consequence that happens as a result of those changes. Like, for instance, with communism, where the Afghan royal family most likely did not think to themselves when they were sending out students to the Soviet Union in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Well, by the 60s, maybe they did, but by the 40s and 50s, 20 years later, these lot are going to topple a government and start a coup. It's an unintended side effect that happens. But the slower you have modernization, the easier for you to be able to judge what the unintended side effects are going to be. But the problem with that is that you might die because your neighbors might become way stronger than you. With Nader Shah, his whole outlook, I think, was very smart in the sense that I'm not going to touch what I like to call social or cultural modernization. Like, whatever values, whatever traditions this society has, I'm not going to touch that. Even if the rest of the world tells me that chopping people's hands off is wrong, I don't want to annoy my people. So you can keep that. However, when it comes to things like material modernization, getting better cars, better roads, better airports, better planes, better dams, just better headphones, better accessories, better everything, better houses, I'm gonna throw the full weight of my focus onto that. And that's very smart, because not only do Afghans not mind that, Afghans would support you, because Afghans are, at the end of the day, I know this might sound funny, humans. And humans in general, they want to improve their lot in life. So I think that's why Nader Shah was a very capable ruler.
Yeah,
He
makes
understood his
sense.
people. He understood his people. He realized we can't do this too quickly, even though it would help us if we, on one level, it would help us if we did this quickly. But at the same time, we need to have a proper game plan, because even after World War II, that kind of modernization, it's not really that smart. I mean, because basically, Erlend, we skipped past one other episode.
Yeah.
There's two episodes of democracy. So one of them we mentioned, the constitutional decade, 63 to 73, basically. And then there's one where it's for like, say, 4 years, where it's really like 2 years, 1949. No, 1947 to 1951. But you can extend it to 53 as well, where the Afghan royal family allow parliamentary elections to take place, and freedom of not of speech, sorry, freedom of press happens then as well. But the exact same thing happens. It's just chaos, anarchy. People start talking about crazy ideas like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have a monarchy in the first place. And the monarchy is like, wait. This is not what we meant when we said you can have freedom of speech. So
it's freedom of speech, but not freedom of press, but not freedom of press.
Yeah, exactly. It's what it is that what you need to have is common sense. And I know that sounds really strange because it's very subjective, and it is, but I don't think that Afghanistan, and I would love to hear somebody argue differently to this, but not take the moral high ground type of approach, which is very fashionable nowadays. I don't think countries like Afghanistan, maybe even any country you could argue, could have an uninhibited, uncontrolled, unrestrained modernization plan that just goes, let's just modernize everything. I think it would be way smarter for people to come together and come up with a plan that is congruent to that society, that is in line with their values, and moves at a pace which is comfortable, seemingly comfortable, because being in your comfort zone is not a great thing either, to those people. To just say, all right, here's freedom of press, here's freedom of speech, here's democracy, here's these rights, those rights, all at the same time. It's like, dude, I've never really had these. What am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you on. And before you go, do you have anything you want to promote, any social media you want me to plug in the description?
Before I do that, I want to thank you, Erlend. This was awesome. I love talking about, Afghan history. But yeah,
The
in
honor
terms
was
of
mine.
plugging, that's great to hear. In terms of plugging, just check out Hikma History YouTube channel. We've got a bunch of new content coming up. Been very active in terms of Afghan history recently on my YouTube channel. So if you guys are interested, check that out. Besides that, social media, Instagram, Twitter, I'm pretty active on as well. Hikma History. So check that out.
Thank you so much for coming. This has been That 12. Next week, we will take a look at the British military in the 16th century with Stephen Gunn. Until my name is Anand, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And I'll see you next time.